Hollywood's golden era was built on glamour, elegance, and carefully polished images, but behind the cameras, some of its most famous actresses developed reputations that were anything but sweet. Some were described by colleagues as demanding and ruthless. Others were known for explosive tempers, brutal honesty, or treating people around them with little patience. But how much of these stories was actually true, and how much was simply Hollywood gossip? From legendary stars who reportedly terrified their co-stars to actresses whose perfectionism made them notoriously difficult to work with, these are 10 actresses whose off-screen reputations could be far harsher than their glamorous screen personas suggested. And remember, being difficult, demanding, or temperamental doesn't automatically make someone cruel. Some stories are documented, while others come from memoirs, interviews, and long-standing Hollywood accounts. Let's begin. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford built one of the most remarkable careers in Hollywood history. But behind the glamorous image was a woman whose reputation for being intensely demanding followed her for decades. Crawford was famously serious about her career. She expected discipline, preparation, and professionalism from herself, and often expected the same from everyone around her. Co-stars and crew members sometimes described her as intimidating, particularly when she believed someone wasn't giving their best effort. Her legendary feud with Bette Davis only strengthened the perception that Crawford could be fiercely competitive. Their rivalry became one of Hollywood's most famous, eventually exploding publicly through whatever happened to Baby Jane. But Crawford wasn't simply a villain behind the scenes. She could also be generous and fiercely loyal to people she respected. The more complicated truth is that her determination, ambition, and perfectionism could sometimes come across as cold or ruthless. For a woman who fought her way from poverty to Hollywood royalty, Crawford rarely apologized for being tough. Bette Davis. Bette Davis didn't become one of Hollywood's greatest actresses by being timid. Known for her powerful performances and uncompromising personality, Davis developed a reputation for being blunt, demanding, and extremely difficult when she believed a production wasn't meeting her standards. She famously refused to quietly accept studio decisions she disagreed with. During Hollywood's studio era, that kind of independence could make an actor a target for executives, and Davis repeatedly fought battles over scripts, casting, and creative control. Her rivalry with Joan Crawford became legendary, but Davis had conflicts with other people throughout her career as well. Yet calling her simply cruel would be unfair. Davis was also respected for her intelligence, professionalism, and willingness to stand up for herself when other stars remained silent. Her sharp tongue and intimidating presence certainly earned her enemies. But they also helped create the reputation of a woman who refused to be controlled. In old Hollywood, that combination could make you both feared and admired. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead was one of Hollywood's most unconventional stars. She was glamorous, outrageous, outspoken, and completely uninterested in behaving like the carefully controlled actresses favored by traditional studio executives. Bankhead was known for her wild personality and sharp sense of humor. She could reportedly dominate a room with her presence, and people around her quickly learned that she wasn't someone who could easily be intimidated. Her blunt remarks could be shocking, especially by the standards of her era. She didn't always care whether people approved of her behavior, and her reputation for partying and provocative behavior became almost as famous as her acting. Some people considered her rude or cruel, while others found her honesty refreshing. Bankhead's biggest problem with Hollywood may have been that she simply refused to play by its rules. She wasn't interested in pretending to be the perfect movie star. And sometimes, that refusal to filter herself made her appear far harsher than the glamorous image audiences expected from Hollywood actresses. Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn was one of the most independent women in classic Hollywood, and that independence could make her intimidating. Unlike many actresses of her generation, Hepburn refused to behave according to traditional Hollywood expectations. She wore trousers, spoke her mind, rejected publicity tactics she disliked, and demanded significant control over her career. Her personality was famously direct. Hepburn didn't appear particularly interested in winning everyone's approval. She could be blunt, sarcastic, and dismissive toward people she didn't respect. Some colleagues admired her confidence, while others reportedly found her difficult or arrogant. Her relationship with Spencer Tracy also became one of Hollywood's most famous romances, although both largely kept their private lives away from the public. What makes Hepburn interesting is that her cruel reputation often seems to come from the same qualities that made her a feminist icon: independence, confidence, and refusal to conform. She wasn't necessarily trying to hurt people. She simply wasn't interested in making herself smaller to make other people comfortable. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor became famous for her beauty, but her personality could be just as powerful. By the time she reached adulthood, Taylor had already spent years inside Hollywood's studio system. She understood exactly how the industry worked, and she wasn't afraid to fight for what she wanted. Her relationships, marriages, and personal controversies constantly dominated the press. Her highly publicized relationship with Richard Burton especially turned her into one of the biggest tabloid subjects of the era. Taylor could reportedly be emotional, stubborn, and demanding. But she was also fiercely loyal to people she loved and became known for her philanthropy later in life. Her reputation for being difficult was often mixed with sensationalized coverage of her private life. Hollywood tabloids frequently portrayed powerful women as spoiled or uncontrollable, particularly when they refused to behave quietly. Taylor's story therefore shows why these reputations need context. Was she cruel? Sometimes people around her may have experienced her that way. But the image of Elizabeth Taylor as simply a spoiled Hollywood diva doesn't capture the complicated woman behind the headlines. Lana Turner. Lana Turner was one of MGM's most recognizable stars, famous for her beauty, glamour, and dramatic personal life. But Turner's life wasn't remotely as perfect as her screen image suggested. She experienced turbulent relationships and intense media scrutiny throughout her career. Her private life repeatedly became public entertainment, something that could make anyone defensive and emotionally guarded. Turner could reportedly be demanding and difficult when circumstances became stressful. Her famous daughter Cheryl Crane later became central to one of the most sensational stories surrounding Turner's life after Crane killed Turner's boyfriend Johnny Stompanato in 1958. The incident generated enormous publicity and transformed Turner's private family crisis into a national spectacle. But it would be unfair to use that tragedy as evidence that Turner herself was cruel. Instead, her reputation illustrates how Hollywood often turned complicated personal situations involving women into morality tales. Lana Turner was certainly not the harmless glamour queen her studio image suggested. But the real story is far more complicated than simply labeling her a cruel actress. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner possessed the kind of beauty that made Hollywood obsessed with her. But Gardner herself reportedly had little patience for Hollywood's artificial world. She was outspoken, independent, and famously unwilling to behave like a perfectly polished studio product. Gardner's relationships with famous men, including Frank Sinatra, generated enormous publicity. Their turbulent marriage became one of the most closely followed celebrity relationships of the era. Gardner could be fiercely temperamental and reportedly had a sharp tongue. She wasn't afraid of confrontation, and people who expected a quiet, obedient movie star could find her personality overwhelming. But there was another side to Gardner. She often spoke openly about her insecurities and frustrations with fame. She didn't seem particularly interested in maintaining the fake perfection that Hollywood demanded. Her rough edges became part of her identity. For some people, that made her difficult. For others, it made her authentic. Ava Gardner wasn't necessarily cruel, she was simply a woman who refused to hide her personality behind the Hollywood mask. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters was famous for playing emotionally intense characters, but her real personality could be equally forceful. She was outspoken, ambitious, and known for having strong opinions. Winters didn't always fit the traditional image of the graceful, quiet Hollywood actress. She could be confrontational and was never afraid to talk openly about her career, relationships, or experiences in the industry. Her memoirs later offered revealing accounts of Hollywood life and the people she encountered. Some of her stories portrayed an industry filled with egos, manipulation, and ruthless competition. Winters herself could be extremely direct. That honesty sometimes made her appear harsh, particularly in an industry where actresses were expected to maintain polished public personas. But there was another important side to Winters. She was deeply committed to acting and continued reinventing herself throughout her long career. Her toughness wasn't necessarily about cruelty. It was part of surviving an industry that could be brutally unforgiving toward women. Mae West. Mae West was one of the most fearless women in Hollywood history. She became famous for her sexual confidence, provocative dialogue, and complete refusal to behave like the conventional female star of her era. West didn't simply accept scripts. She often demanded control over what her characters said and how they were presented. Her famous clashes with censors demonstrated just how unwilling she was to surrender her identity. To some executives and critics, West was difficult, provocative, and even dangerous. But that's precisely what made her powerful. She understood that controversy could become publicity. Rather than allowing Hollywood to define her, she turned her personality into a brand. Her bluntness could certainly come across as cruel or dismissive, especially to people who disagreed with her. But Mae West's reputation was largely built around her refusal to be controlled. She wasn't trying to become everyone's favorite actress. She wanted power. And in an industry dominated by men, she learned how to get it. Hollywood's golden era created some of the most glamorous women in entertainment history, but fame doesn't reveal what happened behind closed doors. Some of these actresses were genuinely difficult. Others may have simply been ambitious women who refused to obey Hollywood's rules. And some reputations were undoubtedly exaggerated by gossip, sexism, and sensational journalism. Because in old Hollywood, sometimes being powerful, outspoken, or independent was enough to earn a woman the label of cruel. And that's what makes these stories so fascinating. If you enjoy uncovering the darker side of Hollywood's golden age, subscribe for more forgotten scandals, rivalries, secrets, and untold stories from classic Hollywood.